Hi everybody, thank you for joining us today. I'm very happy to introduce our 2023 Mullen Lecture speaker, Professor Melissa Kearney. Professor Kearney holds a BA in Economics from Princeton University and a PhD in Economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where she studied under a National Science Foundation Graduate Student Fellowship and a Harry Truman Fellowship. She is the Neil Moskowitz Professor of Economics at the University of Maryland. She is also Director of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, a Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a non-resident Senior Fellow at Brookings. She's a scholar affiliate and member of the board of the Notre Dame Wilson Sheehan Lab for Economic Opportunities and a scholar affiliate of MIT JPL. She's also an editorial board member of the American Economic Journal Economic Policy and the Journal of Economic Literature, and a former co-editor of the Journal of Human Resources. Professor Kearney's academic research focuses on domestic policy issues, especially issues related to social policy, poverty, and inequality. Her work has been published in leading academic journals and has been frequently cited in the popular press. Today, Professor Kearney is going to talk about her very recent book, The Two-Parent Privilege: How Americans Stopped Getting Married and Started Falling Behind. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the economics department for this invitation. So I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to talk about this new book. In many ways, this book draws on 20 years of work I've been doing in the field of social policy and income inequality. You can probably guess from the title, Two-Parent Privilege. This is about family structure in America, and hopefully by the end of the talk, it'll be exceptionally clear why I've titled this book as I have. But it really is, my goal with this book is to take the topic of family structure out of the culture wars. I recognize that talking about family structure brings up a lot of sensitivities and it's hard to talk about, but I approach the topic as a social scientist. And the book, while it's written to extend beyond an academic audience, it really draws on a lot of data and a lot of academic evidence. And so, my goal here is to talk about this based in facts and in a way that a social scientist is inclined to do. I want to situate the book and my interest in this topic in the broader topics of inequality and social mobility. And this is really how I came to write this book and to think that family structure was super important to talk about as part of our conversation, our national conversation about income inequality and social mobility. So I have been in dozens, at least, dozens of policy-focused conversations over the past 2 decades on the challenges of wide income inequality and eroding social mobility or threats to social mobility in this country. And in my experience, these conversations often focus on the same sets of topics that we know how to talk about as economic policy folks, that we have an idea of what to do to address them, things like having a stronger government safety net, and the need for improved schools, affordable housing, access to affordable college, criminal justice reform, stronger labor market reform institutions, how to have a more progressive tax code so that we have more money to invest in lower income people. All of these topics that I'm really keen to talk about and I think are super important. But again, in my experience in these kinds of conversations, there was often this elephant in the room, which was, what about the need for stronger families? Okay? As I'm going to show you very clearly with a lot of data over the next 60 minutes, there's a wide divide now in family structure in the US. And it got to the point where I felt like it wasn't quite honest or productive to try and have conversations about income inequality or social mobility in America without addressing this elephant in the room. And so that's why I wrote this book, and that's what I'm hoping to accomplish with it. So let me just start with a whole bunch of facts about what's happened to kids' family structure in the US. Right? So the first motivating fact is just the tremendous decrease in the share of US kids who are living with married parents. That share has fallen from 77% in 1980 to 63%. So just over 60% of American kids are living with married parents in the US now. It's not the case that what's happened instead is that parents are just living together in all but, in what it looks like a marriage arrangement and long-term cohabitation. So only 8% of kids in the US, according to the US Census data, only 8% of kids live with one parent and the parent's partner. And that 8% actually overstates the share of kids who are living with unmarried parents, because in about a quarter to 40% of those situations, the parent's partner is not the child's other biological parent. The much more common arrangement now is to live with only one parent, in particular an unpartnered mother. So more than 1 in 5 children in the US live with an unpartnered mother, and that means a mom who has neither a spouse or an unmarried partner in the household. Another 4% of kids live with neither parent, and another 4.5 or 4.7% of kids live with an unpartnered father. Okay, so really what we're talking about now is a really high share of kids living with only one parent. This is higher than in any other country in the world for which we have data. I'm taking this international map here from the Pew Research Center, and this should really be jarring to us. By their methodology, they calculate that 23% of US kids lives in a one-parent home. That's more than 3 times the average around the world. And it's much higher than the average in Europe, which is an average of 13%. So sometimes I'm met with the idea that we're just becoming more European, where couples don't get married. Even couples in Europe who aren't married are much more likely to be living together, or parents who aren't married are much more likely to be living together in long-term cohabiting relationships. And as I already showed you, that's not the case in the US. So this is a case of US exceptionalism that, again, hopefully by the end of the talk I'll have you convinced is not something that's been particularly good for US kids. Nor is it something that reflects the economic success of US women. So why do I say that? There is a huge college gap in married parent families in the US. And this is why this is an issue that has so many elements of inequality at play. So 84% of kids born to college-educated moms in the US live with married parents, as compared to only 60% of kids whose moms have a high school degree, or 57% of moms who have less than a high school degree. And this is a first clue as to why I've titled this book The Two-Parent Privilege, because the most economically successful, advantaged women in our society are the ones most likely to have the privilege or benefit or assistance of a partner in the household helping them raise their kids. Okay? It's also not the case that single-parent homes are now sort of limited or tightly tied with teen childbearing or only the most disadvantaged in society. So this is really, I think, an underappreciated story here. If you look at the decrease in married parent homes for the middle group, moms who have graduated high school, that's fallen 23 percentage points in a 40-year period. I mean, that's really a seismic shift. And I'm going to show you this puts pressure on millions of moms trying to do this by themselves at the same time as the economy has become pretty difficult. And this is going to ultimately deprive kids of resources. Cohabitation does not make up for this college gap. So only 12% of kids whose moms have a 4-year college degree are living in unpartnered mother homes. But again, you see the convergence of the sort of middle class or middle socioeconomic group of mothers, moms with a high school degree. Now 29% of them, 29% of their children live in an unpartnered mother home. Okay, so really this college gap, I think, has been underappreciated and is a really important part of what's happening in America to families. There's also big differences across race and ethnic groups. But what I'm going to focus on or show you that I think, again, is underappreciated is the emergence of this college gap, even within race and ethnic groups in the US over the past 40 years. So what I'm showing you here is the share of children living with married parents, cohabiting parents, or an unpartnered mother by maternal education crossed with race or ethnicity. So this is all the kids of white moms. 88% of kids who have white moms with a college degree live in married parent homes, as compared to 60 or 60+% of white children whose moms don't have a college degree. We see a similar college gap among the children of Hispanic moms. We see among the children of black moms, if their mom has a college degree, they're twice as likely to live in a married parent home. But you see that the levels are much lower than all three other major race and ethnic groups that I categorize in the census data. 60% of children who live with a black mom with a college degree live in a married parent home, as compared to only 31 or 30% of the other groups. Interestingly, Asian children in the US, or the children of moms who identify as ethnically Asian in the census, we don't see this education divide or gap among that group in the US. You can see that across the education groups, there's a really high share of two-parent households. So they're a bit of an exception to the rule that I'm otherwise, or the trends I'm otherwise describing. This is in 1980. So in 1980, there was, by that point, what had happened over the 60s and 70s was an emergence of a gap in the family structure or the prevalence of married parent homes between black and white families in the US, and you can see that in this figure. And this attracted attention in the 80s. There was a series of studies or focus on this topic of the black-white gap. But you don't see this huge college divide at that time. So if we go back and we compare what happened in 1980 to 2020, essentially what you see is the levels have decreased across the board, but they've really plummeted outside the college-educated class, again, with the notable exception of Asian Americans. All right, this has, at a very basic level, exacerbated income inequality in this country. So let me walk you through what I'm doing here with census numbers, all right? If you look at the top panel, what I'm showing you here is what has happened to household earnings in the US over this 40-year period, just looking at households that have two parents. So this will be very familiar to labor economists. Labor economists, we just want to look at earnings and condition on these other things. So what's happened for households headed by college-educated parents? Earnings have gone up 59%. For the middle education group, they've gone up by 8%. And for the bottom group, they went down by 14%. This is the familiar story of widening earnings inequality over this time period. The college-educated workers have done really well. Their earnings have gone up a lot. There's been stagnant wages, primarily for the middle class, and the bottom's not done as well. Okay? So the top panel is what's happened to household inequality, and it looks just like what happened to earnings inequality. The middle panel, now I'm just looking at unpartnered mother households. Again, we see college-educated mothers have really seen an increase in earnings. College-educated workers over this 40-year period, men and women alike, have done very well. What's happened to unpartnered mothers in the middle and lower group? Their earnings have gone up by 19% and 24%. We know this, again, from established facts and evidence in economics. Welfare reform, the Earned Income Tax Credit, a good economy in the 90s. Single moms are much more likely to be working in 2020 than they were in 1980. Their earnings have gone up a bit. Single mothers are less disadvantaged in the past. So as a whole, single moms have more earnings than they used to across the board. What I show you in the bottom panel is now let me just look at earnings coming into households without conditioning on the number of parents. So I'm allowing that to move in the background as it has in the real world. So now we see the earnings of households headed by a mom with a four-year college degree went up by 55%. Okay? In the middle group, earnings went down by 4%. In the bottom group, it went down by 20%. Why? Because even though high school educated workers saw their earnings go up by about 8%, high school educated single moms saw their earnings go up by 19%, high school educated moms are now 20 percentage points more likely to be the only adult in their household. And so that's exacerbated the economic insecurity of middle class households. You combine stagnant wages with a reduction in the likelihood of having two adults in that household, and you get a more economically insecure or vulnerable situation. And that's exactly what's happened. Same with the less than high school moms. Even though their earnings went up, the single moms went up, household earnings went down by 20% because these households are substantially more likely now to only have one adult in the household. So at a very mechanical level, the fact that there's been this decrease in two-parent households outside the college-educated class has contributed to the economic insecurity of the middle class and has widened household inequality. Okay. On a more macro or aggregate or neighborhood level, it has now been documented that the share of households in a neighborhood headed by married or two parents is a big predictor or correlate of rates of upward mobility of kids from that neighborhood. So here I'm pulling out a finding from that first paper from what's now the Opportunity Insights Lab at Harvard, the team of researchers, Raj Chetty and his collaborators who have access to millions of IRS records and track kids over time. What they showed in this first really groundbreaking paper that mapped social mobility across the US is that these were the 4 factors of a neighborhood that were most tightly correlated with rates of upward mobility for kids from that neighborhood. Fraction of households headed by married adults, fraction of single moms, high school dropouts, and the social capital index. When I saw this finding in their paper in 2014, this really gave me a lot of pause as an economist, because all of the things that we had been focusing on and we talk about and we study and we get funded to study, college tuition, colleges per capita, state EITC exposure, mean household income, they were not highly correlated with rates of upward mobility. And so I took this to heart. I was like, wow, it's a whole bunch of things that sort of more fall into the bucket of what we might describe as social norms or culture. They're sort of harder for us to grapple with as economists. Okay, this is yet another sort of really clear data-driven piece of evidence to me that suggests we needed to be paying attention to this factor. Okay, so those were some of the key facts I wanted to establish. Now let me spend a few minutes talking about what is driving these trends. The first thing I think is really important to establish is that this is not a story of more divorce. Divorce conditional on being married is actually down in the US, but what has happened is that there's been a very large share in the rise of parents who are never married in the first place. Okay, so now it's really quite jarring. A small majority of unpartnered mothers were never married. 52% were never married, okay? As compared to 39% getting there to their unpartnered mother status through divorce. In the 1980s, this was very different. In 1980s, 64% of unpartnered mothers had been married at some point, but they were divorced, and only 22% were never married. But even here, too, in the status of unpartnered mothers, we see a college divide. So college-educated mothers, 57% of them are divorced as compared to 32% who are never married. For the high school graduates, 56% of those unpartnered mothers were never married. And among mothers with no high school degree, 59% of those unpartnered mothers were never married. I'm going to talk about why all of this matters for kids, but as a preview, I'm going to take a resource-based perspective of this. I already hinted at this. These kids have fewer resources if they're raised in a house with an unpartnered mother. But this is actually important to that. This divide is important to that fact because children whose parents were never married are much less likely to have any sort of engagement or interaction with their second parent, almost always the father, and they're less likely to have child support or other financial support coming in. So even the fact that unpartnered mothers now are more likely to have never been married, and the fact that that's disproportionate among unpartnered moms who don't have a college degree is really important to why this matters for kids, right? Because never married parents are very unlikely to keep, that second parent, we just see it in the data, is very unlikely to be a meaningful presence in the child's life, and that's much less true if the parents were at some point married. Okay, we can see differences by race, ethnicity too. So a small majority, just a small majority of white moms are divorced as opposed to never married. When we look at unpartnered black moms, 70% of them were never married, 54% of unpartnered Hispanic moms. And we similarly see the reverse. The children of unpartnered moms who identify as ethnically Asian, more of them are divorced than never married. Okay, so again, here too, we see this education class racial divide in the status of unpartnered mothers, which is going to have implications for how much they're really doing this by themselves and whether they have resource support from a second parent. Okay, so that's the first thing. It's not driven by divorce, it's driven by a rise in never marriage. The second trend I want to establish is that this reflects more generally an education class divide and rates of marriage overall. So this is the one place, I think, in the talk and in the book where I go back to the 1960s and 70s. Otherwise, I've really focused on the past 40 years. It's hard enough to describe 40 years, okay? But in the 60s and 70s, what happened? Major social and cultural changes, or change in expectations about gender norms. And we see across the three education groups, for both men and women, a decrease in shares of marriage. Okay, so marriage fell for everybody in the 60s and 70s. But then quite strikingly, in the 80s, you see a divergence. In the 80s, the decline in marriage stalls out among college-educated men and women. There has not continued to be a decline in marriage. But among those with less than a 4-year college degree, marriage has continued to decrease. And again, this isn't just a story of the most disadvantaged. Look at the high school educated adults. Their marriage rates have now converged down to the least educated, most disadvantaged, in an economic sense, adults in society. Okay, so what has happened? I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what I think is going on in my read of the evidence. But basically, from looking at this figure, you can see that there was sort of a social cultural change that hit everyone the same in the 60s and 70s. And then what I'm going to propose is that divergent economic conditions in the 30, 40 years since interacted with those new social norms in ways that disadvantaged the non-college educated class when it came to the institution of marriage. Okay, so here I'm just breaking this down again by the interaction of race and ethnicity and education. So you can see, again, the decline has been less pronounced among Asians. It's been quite pronounced among Hispanics, blacks, less so among whites, but it's all driven essentially by, or it's disproportionately driven outside the college-educated class. Okay, there's various explanations. What's going on here? Well, the various explanations, let's start with the marriageable male hypothesis. So the idea here, which dates back to William Julius Wilson's really important work from the 1980s, looking at differences there in family structure and marriage rates among black and white adults in the US. What he argued was that the divergence in family structure that occurred in the 60s and 70s reflected the difficult economic position of black men in America then, and he was really focused on urban black families. What drew his attention was this, the higher share of single mother households among black families, and what he said, he created this marriageable male index. So look at men in a race age group who were employed and not in prison, okay? And so he was arguing that that discrepancy between the marriageability, the marriageable men index between black and white men could describe some of that racial gap. Fast forward to 2020 when this is no longer just a racial gap, but as I've showed you, a large education gap. The idea is that the marriageability of non-college educated men in general has decreased. Okay, so to the extent that men without a college degree have been hit by some of these economic shocks that have put them out of the labor market, have reduced their earnings, their attractiveness of marriage partners is decreased. Okay, in plain English, if the guy's not going to be stably employed and financially provided for me, I don't, the bar for whether I'm going to marry him is now higher, and fewer men are hitting that bar. Okay, so that's the marriageable male hypothesis. Okay, I'm going to show you this. Yeah, okay, well, no, I know people get married for love and all that too, but marriage, really is fundamentally an economic contract, right? It is a long-term contract to pool your resources together and produce, take care of home production, produce things for your household, and take care of kids. That is a long-term economic contract, right? And if the economic value or the economic value of that proposition decreases in certain groups, we, as very romantic economists, expect to see marriage rates decline, okay? So it fits with general patterns, which I'm going to show you, but there's also very compelling causal evidence that there's a causal chain here from the economic shocks that have disproportionately hurt the economic position of non-college educated men to an increase in single mother households. A related but distinct idea is that women's relative economic position has improved. Okay, so at the same time, it's very hard to distinguish these two things in the data, okay, because they've happened sort of at the same time, but I'm going to talk about them. Realize there's a distinction here. The one is just men have become less marriageable in certain groups. The other is that women's relative economic position has improved. So let's go back to my very romantic model for how people decide whether they want to get married. It's not just about how much the other person would bring to the marriage, but how much can I achieve on my own. And so women's financial independence, right, also raises the bar for whether they're going to get married. If I can support a household by myself, that makes me more likely to set up my own household. Okay. A third explanation is cultural shifts. There's been an erosion of social norms. There's been an erosion of the social convention of marriage, raising kids in marriage, right? And so some of this is, economists like to focus on economic explanations for things. Cultural observers, political scientists will often talk about cultural shifts, expectations changing, et cetera. So that's happening in the background, and it's a bit of a debate about how much is one versus the other. And then a final idea that is, a perennial suggestion, which I'm going to largely reject, but with some nuance, which I'll talk about, is that welfare makes single motherhood more feasible and attractive. And what I'm going to say, my proposition or argument is that we do not have the high rates of kids in this country, 1 in 4 living with one parent, because of our incredibly generous welfare system, okay? That is not what's happening. So I'm going to run you through all 4 of these briefly. So the first, let me just show you descriptively that the aggregate trends line up with this story about the marriageable male. So this is just very crude. I'm just taking our familiar 4 race and ethnic groups crossed with our 3 education groups. And what you can see is that for men whose earnings have gone up the most, their marriage rates have gone down the least. And for men whose earnings, have not gone up as much, their decline in marriage is most pronounced, with the notable exception of Asian men without a high school degree and some college. So remember, I showed you that Asians were an exception. There, we didn't see this college divergence in family structure across the education distribution. And so the first question is, well, maybe non-college educated men did better than men of other race and ethnicities. That's not the case. Their change in earnings was the same. As economists would say, they're off the regression line. So their decline in marriage was less than this basic prediction about economics would have suggested. Okay, so this, broadly we see correlations or we see trends that are consistent with the explanation. Here I'm looking at the change in women's relative earnings and marriage. Okay, so for women whose earnings relative to men went up the most, that's where we see the largest reductions in marriage. And for women whose relative earnings changed the least, we see the smallest reductions, okay? What's really important here, and again, why this is a bit nuanced, is if you just look at the change in women's earnings and marriage, college-educated women have seen the largest increase in their earnings, and yet they're the ones whose marriage rates have not decreased, okay? So this is why I very clearly state this is not a success story of feminism, right? So to the extent that college-educated women are doing really well, making high earnings, they're the ones who are still getting married and having the benefit of a married partner in their household helping them raise kids, okay? It's women who are not doing as well economically who are more likely to find themselves in the position of having their own household with kids. So this is why it's, this is not a success story to the extent that, the most educated, successful women in society are deciding they want to do it themselves. I think more likely we're seeing less economically successful women enduring this really challenging role of having to raise kids without a partner in the house, okay? And that's why, this is the sort of empathetic position very clearly in my mind is to not accept this reality where college-educated women are killing it in the workforce and get the benefit of a committed partner when it comes to raising their kids, and millions of less economically secure women are finding themselves having to do it by themselves. Okay. So what about causal evidence of a link? Let me describe 3 papers that I think really help make the case that there's a causal channel from these economic shocks to what we see happening in family structure. So 2 papers that I think are really helpful in making the case for a decline in the marriageable male are a study of what happened in communities that got hit by a loss of manufacturing employment. Okay, so Outerdoorn and Hansen have a paper that looks at the trade pressures when the US imported more from China in the post-WTA world. What happened? We saw in communities that were heavily invested in manufacturing jobs a loss in these well-paying jobs for non-college educated men. And there's been follow-up work that has confirmed this. And in those affected communities, you see after this happened a reduction in marriage and a rise in the share of children living with single moms. In a similar vein, this paper by Guntella, Anelli, and Stella shows that in communities that were heavily invested in industrial production, when employers, firms started adopting industrial robots and there was a loss in jobs, a loss of earnings for non-college educated men, you see a reduction in marriage and an increase in the share of kids living in single mother homes. I can't tell you in the data which side is driving this. To what extent is it moms deciding you're no longer stably employed, you're not an attractive marriage proposition? To what extent is it men deciding I don't feel like I have the financial stability to support a family and therefore I'm not going to commit? All I know is in the data what we see is that there are more single mother homes in these communities after they're hit with these shocks that disproportionately hurt the economic security of non-college educated men. Nama Shanav has a paper that more directly considers this explanation about the relative rise in women's wages. And she very cleverly also exploits differences across communities in the US based on occupational and industry composition at the start of the period. So the idea is in places where women were more likely to be employed in industries and occupations that hit, positive national shocks and did really well, and men were more likely to be employed in industries and occupations that didn't do so well. In those places, what you see is a rise in women's relative earnings leads to a reduction in marriage. Okay, so we have causal support for both the decrease in marriageable men and the increase in women's relative position. Okay, so for a long time, what I thought was what we needed to do to see a return to marriage and an increase in two-parent homes outside, college-educated adults was we needed to improve the economic position of men. I still think that's true, but now I think it's necessary and not sufficient. And one of the reasons why is because in work with my former student Riley Wilson, we looked at what happened in communities that had an economic boom from fracking. Okay, so fracking was one of the few good economic shocks to hit non-college educated men in this 40-year period. So in the early 2000s, communities around the country, and we don't consider North Dakota and South Dakota, so if you're already thinking that was a lot of migrants, right? We're looking elsewhere in the country. Thousands of communities had localized fracking booms. They just happened to be in places where their geology was such that they could take advantage of this new technology. And we established, as have others, that in those places, what happened after fracking was introduced was an increase in the employment and earnings and relative earnings of non-college educated men. Some of that was in the oil and gas extraction business, but more so also just realized it was like a local boom, okay? So it was in jobs in other sectors as well. So we document that, and then we looked at what was the family formation response. And going in, testing a reverse marriageable man story, I was expecting to find that this increase in male earnings and their increase in the relative earnings of non-college educated men was going to lead to a reduction in the non-marital birth share. That is not what the data indicate at all. So what happened in these communities that had these localized economic shocks, male earnings went up, births went up, and economists have shown this, that in econ parlance, kids are normal goods. If there's an income shock, people have more money. One of the things they do is they have more kids. But it happened in equal proportion among unmarried and married adults, and there was no change in marriage rates. Okay, so that wasn't what we were expecting. And so we looked to see, gosh, maybe social norms played a role. And if you looked across communities, the increase in births to unmarried adults was largest in places that at baseline had a larger share of kids being born outside marriage. So we wanted to probe on that potential explanation further, and we looked back at what happened in Appalachian communities in the 1970s and 80s during the coal boom and bust. So when coal prices went up, in coal-producing counties, male earnings went up, and you saw an increase in marriage, an increase in married births, and a decrease in the non-marital birth share. So you have a very similar economic shock in similar communities, 40 years apart, and very different family formation responses. This leads me to conclude that how people respond to economic shocks depends on the social construct. And so in many of these communities, again, I've shown you that outside the college-educated class, we've already had this debundling, this decoupling of having kids from being married, such that now that social convention is not nearly as tight. And so in the 70s and 80s, when male earnings went up, and people wanted to have more kids, they did so inside a marital union. 40 years later, that's no longer true. And so that, if we go back to the list of 3 explanations, this makes me think that some of what's going on is a reduction in marriageable men, some of what's going on is an increase in the relative economic position of women, and some of what's going on is changing social norms. I actually think it's worth pointing out that there seem to be different social norms at this point among college-educated folks and everyone else, based on the prevalence. So the arrows here are running in circles between economic conditions that led us to a place, you get a new social norm, the social norm dictates how people respond to economic shocks, okay, and these things sort of take on a life of their own. So let's get to the 4th explanation. So why do I say that welfare is not to blame? Well, I'm focusing on the past 40 years. And in the 1980s, in the 1990s, there was a concern that our welfare program at the time, AFDC, that really was available to single moms. That was a program that had started to serve widows. By that point, the caseload was almost entirely made up of women who were never married. And so there was a backlash against our cash welfare program. And in 1996, we had national welfare reform. So since 1996, cash welfare in this country is very hard to access, and it is not at all generous. Okay? So the reason why we have so many single mother households is not because it's easy to live on welfare alone. And in fact, only less than 15% of single mothers now get cash welfare from TANF or SSI, which are our major cash assistance programs. Okay? Now, 40% do rely on SNAP, 70% do rely on Medicaid, and a lot rely on the Earned Income Tax Credit. So it's not that we don't have support for single mother households, but we do not have overly generous or easy to access cash benefits. And of course, if we look at other countries, what we see is countries with much more generous welfare support systems have lower rates of single mother households, right? But I want to be fair to sort of, this line of thinking that welfare might matter. Had we not reformed welfare in 1996, maybe our counterfactual rate of kids living in single parent homes might be even higher now, but we did reform welfare. And so my main point here is we are not going to meaningfully reduce the share of kids living in single mother homes by making it even harder for them to access cash benefits. All right, the third sort of point I want to make is that this is not driven by rising birth rates. In fact, it's sort of quite surprising how much of a rise in single mother households we've had, given that birth rates are way down in the US, and in particular, teen birth rates. So teen births have decreased over 70% since the early 1990s. That's a stunning achievement because teen childbearing is difficult for the moms and the kids, okay? If you told me in 1990 that teen birth rates were going to go down by 70%, I would have predicted a decline in single mother households. Because really, in 1980s, early 90s, single mother households were predominantly among women who had initiated childbearing really young. But look, births to young women in their 20s have also really declined. In fact, births to every group under the age of 30 has declined in the US. Okay, and this is true across race and ethnic groups, and it's across education groups. Moms are now older and more educated than in the past. So if we just had the changing composition of mothers' characteristics or who was becoming a mother, all else equal, we would have predicted a decline in single motherhood. But all else has not been equal, right? We've had a massive increase in the share of births that are outside marriage. 40% of births in the US are now to unmarried parents. Okay, that's more than double in 40 years. 40% of births outside marriage. That's what has happened to kids' family structure in the US. There's been a decoupling of marriage from having and raising kids. And that's what's driving this, not divorce and not birth rates. Okay, you could see this basically across, again, all of our 12 groups. All right, so the biggest increase is from women in their 20s. In 1990, 37% of births to women in their young 20s were outside marriage. Now it's 67%. 40% of births to moms in their late 20s are outside of a marriage. 91% of teen births are outside of marriage, but now we have very few teen births. So again, this is really coming from, look at the increase in non-marital births across these groups. Look at among moms with a high school degree, there's been a doubling of the non-marital birth share. Okay, and again, I think this is a really important and underappreciated fact, is that now we're talking about what would have been sort of like the middle class. And when this is 50, this is a majority of moms right here in the middle. Okay, so here's my recap. We had broad changes in social norms and attitudes in the 60s and 70s. And then we come into the 80s with these new set of social norms and gender expectations. And there's a bunch of economic shocks that disproportionately harm non-college educated men. That erodes the economic attractiveness of marriage as an institution for non-college educated adults. And so we get this decoupling of childbearing and marriage in affected populations and regions. And now we're in a new social paradigm where outside the college-educated class, it's quite common and widespread to have kids outside marriage and to be raising kids in a one-parent home, right? So this is going to be very hard to reverse. I will be the first to admit that, right? Because now we're in a new social paradigm, and once a social paradigm is established, it's really hard to change it. Okay, what does this mean for kids? As a very practical level, and this is why nothing I'm saying here is moral or value laden. At a very practical level, households with 2 adults have more resources to give and invest in their kids than a household with 1 adult, right? So nothing about that should denigrate single moms or single dads who are doing it by themselves. It's to recognize that there are a lot more resources in the household if there are 2 adults. Income is a big resource, but it's not the only one, right? There's income, there's time, there's emotional energy, and what we see is that those gaps in resources translate into gaps in kids' outcomes. Okay, so kids are expensive. Let's start with that. But one of the things that's happened over, recent decades that, again, is contributing to class gaps in kids' outcomes, their preparedness for school, their readiness for college, is that the highest income parents are showering tons of money on their kids. Okay, so I'm taking this from a study by Conrick and Furstenberg. They looked at they looked at spending data in a nationally representative sample of U.S. households. How much money high-income families are spending on their kids has really gone through the roof. And this understates it, by the way, because this doesn't count for housing. And we know one of the things that parents do is spend a lot of money on a house in a really good school district. That's not even in here. This is direct spending on education, on enrichment activities, on items in the CEX that we see being tied to the kid. Why does this relate to parents' family structure? Because it's really rare and hard to be in the upper part of the income distribution with only one adult in the household. Okay, so this is another way that two-parent households are pulling away from everyone else. They're spending tons of money on their kids. Okay, we also see that this is more so at the high school level than the college level, but we see a gap in kids in the time that moms and dads spend with their kids by education and marital status. So both married men and married women spend more time with their kids than single parents. But of course, the kids who live with married parents get both of these higher bars, okay? So you're getting more parental time because there's two parents in the household, and you get more time from each one. Why? Because it's easier to spend time to sit down with your kid, to read to them, to do homework with them, to drive them around, if there's another person in the house who could do all the other stuff. If you're the only person who has to go to work and raise them and make the money, to do the cooking, to do the cleaning, to mow the lawn, to help your kid with homework, there's only so much time to give. And so parental time is another way that kids of college-educated parents, of married parents, are pulling away from everyone else. Okay? Why do higher resource parents invest more? There's all sorts of theories. I come down on the simplest one of all. Married parents have more bandwidth, okay? We actually see in the data, I do not see any compelling survey evidence that non-college educated parents have different views about parenting, want to spend less time with their kids. What seems really compelling to me from the evidence that I read, and also common sense, you have more bandwidth, you have more patience to give your kid if there's someone else in the house who can help you out, okay? So there's more money, there's more time, there's more bandwidth. And the other thing is, we know that kids benefit from all those things. So let me make 3 really important points here. Does a couple have to be married to get this benefit? Well, no. If a couple lives together and pooled their resources and shared in all of the household work and raising childcare, in my approach to this, with a research-based approach, there wouldn't be much difference. But as a practical matter in the US, what I've already showed you is marriage is the most reliable institution by far that delivers that to kids. Okay, we just don't really see widespread parents living together and raising their kids together when they're not married. Second, do the parents have to be biological? So this moves us from a resource perspective to a relationship perspective. You can also put in here same-sex parents. This is outside the scope of what I'm talking about. So I'm taking this really broad economic lens to the issue, and I'm just looking at how many parents are there and the resources. So there are a lot of scholars who look at the nuances of how families, what the relationships are and how that dictates. But from an aggregate perspective, what's dramatically changed in the US is not the nature of children's relationships to the parent, not the fact that there are more same-sex couples now, or that there are fewer step-parent families. The major change is in the number of kids living with only one parent. And so that's why I'm setting this all aside. And then the other thing that needs to be said, of course, is that what the second parent brings to the household is really important. So if that second parent would be harmful or abusive, that of course will not be beneficial for anybody in the household. And actually there's 2 really recent, compelling, sad papers in economics, separate papers, showing that when there's a criminally convicted parent, if they just randomly get assigned to a judge who's more likely to put them in prison, it actually looks like that's beneficial for the kids, right? And so actually having a parent who, who's been convicted of criminal behavior in the household is not necessarily beneficial to the kid. And let me put a separate point on this. When, my big policy punchline from all of this is we need to strengthen families. There are millions of kids who have an incarcerated parent, and there are community groups around the country trying to work with those families, because it is hard for kids and the parent when a parent comes home for prisoners in prison. So this is a really vulnerable population that I actually think deserves and needs a lot more support. Okay. We have mounds of evidence that children from married parent families have better outcomes. The thing is, we don't have an RCT, right, a randomized control trial. So we have no study, we couldn't, it would be illegal for good reason, to randomly assign kids to live with married parents or not. And so the social scientist who really doesn't like this idea that marriage might be beneficial will say, well, it might be all these other things about parents that you can't observe. So to buy that argument, what you have to think is, it's not that having a second parent and their income and their time and their emotional bandwidth would be helpful, but rather the kind of people who are married would just be better parents anyway. And my question is that really what we want to push on? Do we really think that 40% of kids in this country are born to parents where the second parent just wouldn't be a good parent? I'm not inclined to think so. I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming that there are a lot of extra resources in a household with 2 parents. And to the extent I'm patient at all with my kids, it's because I have someone else I could turn to when I'm out of patience, right? And say, here, you take over. Okay, so the evidence is so overwhelming at this point that, again, I think it's counterproductive to try and explain it away. The other thing that makes me sort of more convinced about this resource story is that when we look, this is from a paper I published in 2017 with frequent collaborator Phil Levine. When we look across moms based on their characteristics, we see gaps in kids' outcomes that are exactly what our resource-based framework, in this paper we have a model and make predictions, what they predict. So let me just show you 2 key outcomes. Let's start with the percent of children with a high school degree by age 20 and the percent of children with a college degree by age 25. And let's start with the first. As you move down this row, the moms are getting more educated. So in the first row, you see that 74% of kids whose moms don't have a high school degree but they're married graduate high school, as compared to 68% of unmarried moms. So the majority of kids in both groups are now graduating high school. It doesn't take as much to get your kid through high school. Mothers with a college degree, unmarried mothers, 88% of their kids graduate high school, and 93% of the married mothers' kids graduate high school. So among moms with a college degree, the overwhelming majority of their kids graduate high school, whether or not they're married. Where's the biggest gap? The biggest gap is in the middle. This is where the growth has been the most. Moms with a high school degree or some college, they're the ones sort of most likely, let's pick someone who has like $35,000, right? Assortative mating, they're probably partnering with someone who has a high school degree, some college. Okay, that's where the mom probably has enough resources on her own to keep her kid out of poverty. The dad probably is, more likely to be employed, have decent earnings. If you pool them, that seems to make a larger incremental difference in whether the kid graduates high school than either among the most or least educated moms, right? So again, if you're looking at the least educated, maybe the dad doesn't bring so much. If you're looking at the most educated, the mom probably has a lot of resources on her own. The middle group is where combining resources might really matter. Then let's look at percent of children with a college degree by age 25. Very few kids whose moms don't have a high school degree graduate college, whether or not they're married. Somewhat higher among moms with a high school degree. The biggest gap is among married moms with a college degree. Why? Because it's not until you basically get 2 parents with a college degree that a majority of kids actually graduate college. That's a really advanced outcome to achieve. And so here you're talking about mom has a lot of resources, but you need the extra resources of another sort of high-achieving person to really push that kid over the line. Now, of course, I would like to see college degree completion more equal across the education and marriage distribution, right? I think we could all agree that more kids should get through college. But what I'm showing you here is having the resources of 2 parents in the household doubles the likelihood that a kid graduates college. This is also really important because a lot of the pushback I'm getting is like, well, we need to do more to guarantee that single moms' kids don't live in poverty. Yes, of course. But you know what? My goals for kids are higher than that. We should not be sufficient with just keeping kids out of poverty. I think what we should aim for is to have a majority of kids, regardless of their parents' circumstances, achieve high earnings themselves, graduate college themselves, right? It's really hard to do that on one, and on the resources of one parent. That's just what the data is showing us, okay? This is more for the, what you can see here is I've smoothed this. This has no income controls, but it controls for everything else. If I control for income, what happens? The gaps become smaller, but they don't go away. And this is really important. This says that income is one of the big differences between married and unmarried households, but it's not the only one driving gaps in kids' outcomes. This is also really important from a policy perspective, because even if we give more income to single-parent households, and I absolutely think that we should as a matter of policy, we're not going to close gaps, because a second parent does more than just provide additional income, right? They provide time, emotional bandwidth, supervision, all these other things that benefit kids. Okay, so the last point I want to make is that we have really compelling evidence that boys are particularly disadvantaged from growing up in a single mother household. Okay, there have been a couple really compelling studies using mounds of data on kids' outcomes that show the gender gap that now favors girls, meaning girls are less likely to get in trouble in school, they're more likely to do well in school, they're more likely to graduate. That gender gap favoring girls or disadvantaging boys is larger among kids, siblings, who grow up without a dad in their home. Okay? So boys seem to be particularly disadvantaged by the absence of dads from their house. And this relates to this whole issue about boys struggling. Okay? So at the same time as the struggle of boys has been increasing, as boys have been losing ground compared to girls, we have an increase in the share of boys in this country who are growing up without a dad in their home. Let me again show you a really striking result that came out of the IRS data work from the Opportunity Insights Lab at Harvard. They have a recent study that looks at black-white gaps in kids' income when they're adults. So they're documenting now what characteristics of a neighborhood are predictive of smaller black-white gaps in boys' outcomes in adulthood. The single biggest predictor of a smaller gap, meaning less disadvantage for black boys as compared to white boys, is the share of black fathers present in that neighborhood. Okay? So this is beyond the benefit of having a dad in one's home. Black boys do better as compared to the white boys who grew up in their neighborhood when there are more black dads in their neighborhood. The tragedy, what these authors show in an appendix table, is the low share of black boys in the US growing up in neighborhoods that have both low poverty rates and high fatherhood presence rates. Okay, what do I think can and should be done? I'm just going to put out my position really quickly. Here's what I think we need to do. This is the most controversial line of the whole book. I think we need to foster a norm of two-parent homes for kids. Okay? The flip side, what many people who disagree with me will say, is that ship has sailed, marriage is like a dying institution, and like let's get over it and support single mother households. And everything that I've showed you has convinced me that we're never going to close class gaps. We're never going to dramatically increase kids' well-being or upward mobility if we just give up on the institution of two-parent households outside the college-educated class. And it really seems to me like a defeatist position to say now only college-educated women are going to, in large numbers, have the benefit of a partner in their household. Only kids lucky enough to be born to college-educated parents are going to be, growing up with two parents in large numbers. That seems way too defeatist to me. So I do not think we should accept this new reality where the two-parent household is a privilege, yet another privilege of the college-educated class. I don't think we should bemoan the economic independence of women, right? So those who would say, well, if women didn't, if they still needed men like in the past, they couldn't be doing this on their own. You will not hear me argue that it sucks women don't have to depend on crappy partners anymore, right? So we have to make the institution of marriage more attractive, again, outside the college-educated class, and I think that will require really addressing the economic erosion of the position of non-college educated men in this country. I also think we should be scaling up programs that show promise of success in strengthening families. These programs get tiny amounts of funding. They are operating on shoestring budgets. What kind of programs am I talking about? I already alluded to one. Programs that work with families who have an incarcerated parent. Responsible fatherhood programs. Programs that help unmarried parents who show up saying they want to make things work but don't know how. They didn't grow up in two-parent households. They don't have married friends. Relationship education programs. Shoestring budget. 1% of the Administration for Children and Families budget goes towards programs deemed to support stable and safe families. To put that in perspective, 15% goes to foster care. What does that mean? We spend way more money in this country taking kids out of families than we do investing in families. There is no federal agency that will fund this kind of research. The Department of Education doesn't fund marriage or family programs. NIH doesn't. We need to make these programs a policy and funding and research priority. At the same time, I am strongly of the view that we need to have a stronger safety net for families regardless of family structure. And I say that while I admit that improving the economic security of single mother families will lead to some people on the margin to choose that. But that is a trade-off that I think we need to make, because the real tragedy here is that there's millions of kids growing up in under-resourced homes. And so that's the real problem that I hope that our country can be committed to solving. Okay, I will stop there and take some questions and comments. Yeah.
I really enjoyed your presentation. I just have a question about single mothers that understand their constraint and decide to move into mom and dad's house. So
decide to what?
Move into their parents' home.
Oh.
Her parents' home.
Yeah.
So basically in your data, these are families of, say, 3.
Yeah, very good question. Yep.
How do you measure the impact of grandparents on the children? And
yeah, good question. So a couple things. First, in the data, what we see is 67% of kids who live with an unpartnered mother do not have another adult in the household. 22% of those kids do have a grandma living with them, or a grandparent, whether the grandparent moved in with them or they moved in with the grandparent. So to your point, grandparents are one way that some single moms sort of get extra assistance, right? But it's not a majority, right? So that's the first thing, just as a practical matter, it's not a majority. Also, I looked, there's some studies, mostly outside economics, that look at engagement with extended family. From the best I can tell, there's no clear evidence that kids who live with single moms are more likely to sort of be engaging with extended family. So the way I think about this is grandparents are really helpful. They're part of a lot of parents' village for raising kids. They don't seem to be making up for the absence of a second parent, nor do they seem to be sort of disproportionately likely to help unmarried parents than married parents. I also will say anecdotally, since I've put out this work, I've been hearing from grandparents who feel quite burdened by having to take up this responsibility. No, this is, I think, a complicated issue. There are a lot of grandparents stepping up. And whether, what that does to elderly well-being, I think is a separate but related issue.
So I have several questions, but they're quick. So the slide where you compared income levels, you had normalized that for inflation so that they were comparatively the same. I assumed you did, but I wanted to check. The second one is you had on there social capital index.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Oh, I have to remember, that's not mine. That's something that other researchers use. And I can't remember exactly how social capital index is constructed, but the way you can think about social capital is how many people in a neighborhood are involved in sort of neighborhood civic institutions.
Okay.
But I should look back exactly to see how those researchers constructed it, but that's the kind of idea.
Okay, and then I have a third question. The third question is, you didn't actually say this, but it sounded to me that children who grew up in a single parent family then thought it was normal for moms to raise children as single parents and fathers to be out of the picture. And so that increased. That was I
didn't say that, but it is certainly true that there's an intergenerational reproduction of these tendencies. So kids who grow up in single mother homes are much more likely to become single mothers themselves. That there's a whole lot of factors going into that. But what I didn't emphasize as much as I should have during the whole presentation is that all of this takes on an intergenerational perspective, right? Which is why it's like perpetuating advantage and disadvantaging across generations. So, yes.
Even the kids in married families see all their friends in unmarried families, and
kids who grow up with college-educated parents are more likely to be in communities with a lot of married parents. Then they're more likely to grow up, graduate college, be married, live in communities with high rates of marriage.
Right.
If you think about all of the stories about non-marriageable men, and the fact that we now have millions of boys, again, outside the college-educated class, growing up in homes without dads, without husbands, and then we ask, in 25 years, are they going to be good husbands? Right? And they don't know how. Yeah. And so this is another thing, again, I take a resource-based perspective, but what I hear anecdotally is there's a lot of relationship problems, there's a lot of trust problems, there's a lot of infidelity, there's a lot of porn. These are boys who don't have dads in their households, and a large number don't have dads in their neighborhood. And how are they going to grow up? How are we going to break this cycle, right? So there's definitely an intergenerational element here.
Do we know if there was ever another time in history where we had similar trends? I'm just thinking, for example, in times of Rome, that there's so many Roman soldiers leaving out for a couple of years or more. Any information? Or
I don't know. I actually just started reading a book that's like, the history of the world of marriage. I'm not conversant in that. One historical point, I think, is, when I talk about marriageable men, there's always been poor families and poor men.
Right.
But we didn't really see marriage fall apart as much. And so I think that's a little bit new, but, right?
What about, for example, the woolen mills, where the women would go and do the weaving and so on, and the men would be back milking the cow or whatever.
Right.
Was that a trend there?
Of single-parent households?
Women earning
look, I do not know, off the top of my head, of a period where 30% of kids lived outside a two-parent home, or 21% of kids lived with unpartnered mothers. But I suspect there's some cultural anthropologist somewhere who will say they've found a place. So I'm not going to say no, but I don't know of one. Yeah.
Okay, so I might be a bit cluttered here. From what I understand, the premise of your talk essentially is that we need to be looking necessarily at how family structure in and of itself correlates to success, rather than the traditional, approach of looking the other way around. But I guess one of the things I'm wondering is it seems like a lot of your solutions still are very much rooted in policy, and still rooted in the sort of funding which still kind of seems as if it's still taking the same approach as that has been been taken. The idea that prosperity in and of itself leads to like these sort of units in and of themselves magically or spontaneously like reproducing themselves. So like, and that seems to just generally be like, I guess, like the sort of lens of the economist, at least from what I've gathered, like the way you talk about like how you were necessarily caught off guard by the whole fracking issue, or how economists seem surprised at how the metrics they usually study don't correlate to success in and of themselves. So I guess what I'm wondering is like, is this actually, I guess, a problem that necessarily is best addressed by policy, or rather instead by like, I guess these more like sociological questions,
Yeah.
these like low level like communities figuring out for themselves how to rebuild the sort of like cultural reproduction, because like a family doesn't just reproduce itself economically. There's it's almost much more of like a sociological question, I feel.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important and fair point, which is, let me clarify one thing. I do try to tell the story with the arrows running both ways, from like inequality driving this inequality in earnings and economic situations, driving the inequality in family structure, the inequality in family structure, then amplifying that inequality. But you're right, at the end of the day, I can't help myself, and I'm still a government policy economist person, and I'm like, the government needs to fund these programs. The government needs to improve the economic position of men. I have softened a bit. This is a big for me, to say a new social norm is necessary. Right? A new social norm is necessary. I'm convinced of that. That is humbling as an economist, right? To say economics and economic policy tinkering are not going to solve this problem. I have some ideas about how to establish a social norm, right? In the sense that we do have good social science evidence that role models matter. This gets to your point. Role models matter. Media messages matter. What community leaders say matter. But now when I'm talking about community leaders, pastors, leaders saying things and affecting what's happening in a community, you're taking me outside my realm of economic policy making.
Okay, and I guess one last quick question, since I guess he mentioned like history and stuff. One of the things I wonder if it might be is like also like, we're like taking like a 60-year window here, but it's also important to remember that around the 50s and 60s, we saw like a drastic change in like the family unit in and of itself, where you had like people moving from these like traditional, I guess, like urban, like immigrant, like tightly immigrant networks to like these suburbanized, like very privatized parent households cut off from the rest of the unit. So I wonder if like having that like sort of like situation, I guess, under like modern capitalism, where like people are like in these like white picket fence, two people in a house, no or larger intergenerational community to rely upon, and also to put expectations on you, this like sort of mutual obligation. But that contributes to it, because as you like point out in your data, like Asians right now are like, there's the least difference between them. But what we see with Asians is that they're the most likely to have these sort of intergenerational units still intact, most likely to still have these structures which resemble like the immigrant structures of old that like were successful back in the day.
Yeah, I think this is another really crucial point, which is that, let me rephrase what you're saying, but the sort of collapse of the two-parent family outside the college-educated class might not have been so consequential in a world where there was still a lot of extended family and people helping raise the kids. So now it's like we're almost in the worst of both worlds, where you've got one parent doing it themselves and not surrounded by a whole larger family community. And this gets back to the initial question about grandparents. And so I don't look at that larger move away from, or move to a nuclear family. But I think your instincts, have to be right, which is that an emphasis on the nuclear family and then the removal or the absence of a second parent is really what's, the heart of the problem.
You're like dependent on like your grandparents and stuff. In turn, like the expectations they place on you to have kids, like, are you gonna have kids? Are you gonna have kids? Are you gonna have kids? And also to like stay, I guess, with your partner and like maintain that like same unit is going to be stronger too.
Oh, that's interesting. That like grandparents help enforce the cultural norm. Yes?
The other thing is, I look at the do part as kind of a whole of society responsibility.
Yeah.
Not just government, but other institutions are also struggling, like the church, for example, which is in my area, is much more or less effective in terms of holding families together.
Yeah.
So it's like everybody needs the whole norm.
That's right.
Whole kit and caboodle.
No, that's right.
Needs to work together.
Yep. No.
To make it happen.
I think that's right. And the loss of trust in other institutions, the loss of social capital, again, all of this exacerbates and amplifies these challenges. And, I like to be optimistic, but it makes it less obvious, the path forward. Yes?
The data that you've reviewed and built your work on, have you considered change in abortion policy over that time period? Could that be a factor that might change some of the correlations?
So the change in abortion policy, well, let's say everything I do is in the pre-Dobbs, post-Roe world. Right. But there's a very famous paper in economics, actually one of the co-authors is Janet Yellen, right now, that looked at the increase in access to legalized abortion and contraceptive technologies in the 60s and 70s. And the argument there in that very famous paper in economics is that that technological shock, as it's described, led to a reduction in the convention of shotgun marriages. Because now, if like the man wasn't as attached to the woman if she got pregnant, because now it was her choice essentially to have a child. And so there is that idea that the convention of shotgun marriage was eroded a bit.
And would also perhaps affect the age correlations.
In what sense?
Well, if more younger women receive more abortions, that might influence the outcome. Or if they didn't, if it's older married women.
Yeah, let me just say this again though. Teen childbearing is way down, and it's not because teen abortion is up. It's because teens aren't getting pregnant as much. So again, like divorce is down, abortion's down, but yeah, these things all play into the establishment of social norms. Yes?
A couple of questions. So you talked about economic shocks. Can you point to one or two of those that you think played a role in the 1980s, sort of driving the trend that you showed us? What would that be like? Is it more emphasis on market economy? Is it something else that you would think?
Yeah, so this is a whole separate line of research that I've been engaged with over my career, but looking at labor market changes. But in broad strokes, you could think about changes in technology and automation, eventually in increased imports from China in particular. All of those kinds of shocks led to a decrease in the demand for non-college educated workers. On top of that, you had institutional changes like a reduction in unions, reduction in the minimum wages during some of those same decades. So you had shocks driving down the demand for less educated workers at the same time as institutions that propped up their wages also decreased. And some of those shocks were weathered better in other countries that had more active labor market policies, more of a commitment to vocational training, right? So you just had this combination of these sort of secular shocks hit US workers with pretty weak institutions to support workers and to get them reemployed. So that's sort of in broad strokes the story. There's also some supply side stories that also led to a reduction in employment among prime-age men, increase in disability insurance access and generosity over this time. The incarceration story is a little bit more nuanced, but obviously mass incarceration has removed a lot of men from their communities and contributed to their subsequent employment struggles.
I see. Another question. So what I found interesting is this. So you have a woman with high school education or less, low income, relatively low income, who chooses to raise a child alone and to raise a child with another partner with, say, a similar income. My guess is, wouldn't the conventional wisdom tell you that it's rather to have two incomes with one child? So the benefit for a person with low income would be probably higher than a woman who's already with college degree and higher income to begin with. So
that's it, right? Right. Yes. If you were an economist who knew nothing about what was happening in the U.S., you might predict that marriage rates were lower among college-educated women.
Because they needed less.
Because they needed less. But we see the exact opposite.
And so that's perhaps because it kind of goes against the explanation of women maybe not trusting in that, because we say, I mean, if he's working and you need him more, then maybe your explanation of maybe changes in social norms actually is a correct one.
Yeah.
But then
It's also complicated. I don't know, again, we can't think about this as one explanation, right? We're talking about 21% of kids have moms who are unpartnered. That's a huge variation. Some of those women really have no choice at all. The man disappeared, never volunteered to be helpful, is abusive, is incarcerated. Some of those moms really have no choice at all. And then I think there's a margin where there's some, who like the dad really wants to be around and the mom wants no part of him, and she's gatekeeping. So like, in the way I write the book, I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not blaming deadbeat dads. I never use that term because there are a lot of non-resident dads who would like to be more involved in their kids' lives. I certainly don't blame moms for making choices that aren't in the best interest of their kids, because there's many moms it's not really a real choice at all. And so I think, at the end of the day, where do I come down? We need to meet families where they are. There's a lot of vulnerable families. Today's families, right? We're not going to turn things around right now. But going forward, and this is breaking the intergenerational cycle, a lot of things have to change. And one is sort of reestablishing this convention of, if you have a child, there's two of you. Two people need to be committed to that child. And where's the margin that has to change? Whose decision has to change? I'm not, what behaviors have to change? That's sort of, I think there's a lot of different explanations depending on any individual situation.
is it possible that people with college degree or higher simply expect that more?
So this is an interesting question, right? Some people would say that college-educated parents are in this for the joint production in their kids. And more is expected of those men, and those men realize that to be married they have to deliver more. So another way to say that is I've gotten a reaction like, hey lady, have you broken the patriarchy? Because until you do that, this isn't going to turn around. Do men outside the college-educated class hold more to former gender norms and are less willing to help out with kids and housework, and that's why the women don't want to partner with them? I don't know, right? That's not in my data, but is that a potential explanation for what's going on? It might be part of it, at least in some settings. Okay, I think we have time for one more.
Dr. Kearney, I just want to say from one term to another, so nice to see you. We reunite here. But really quick question. So you talked about the fracking study where there was the fracking boom. We know that for the men who work in the fracking business, they travel a lot.
Yeah.
Consider the fact that, number one, they are the ones that usually don't set up rules. Number two, fracking is a really labor-demanding job. That is a lot of hard work.
Yeah, so a couple things. So this is why we deliberately exclude North Dakota and South Dakota, because those men are moving in. The other point, this is what I tried to emphasize, it's not just fracking jobs. There was also an increase in retail jobs and other jobs in the communities. But the third point I would make on that is if it looks like fracking is, it's not a desirable job or it's a temporary boom, then it raises an interesting question of, well, why did people think that you respond by having kids but not get married, right? And so there is this interesting story, right? Or you see this in some of the ethnographic works where now in a lot of these communities, it's not that they reject marriage, but the bar for marriage is higher than the bar for having kids with somebody. And this gets to the question of where's the margin of decision that needs to change for this not to happen? But you're okay, well, we got a bunch of temporary income, you're employed right now, you're good enough to have a kid with, but I don't want to marry you because that job might be demanding or it might go away in a few years. Even if that's what's happening, it's pretty striking.
I have one more question, which is about the divorce law and the divorce law and the child protection among the women. Do you think that has any impact on it?
So this is a complicated one, and I deliberately, and I say this in my final chapter, I'm not prepared to suggest any specific changes or reforms to divorce law or child support law. It's really complicated, and there's a lot of unintended consequences. So again, let me just remind everybody, an increase in divorce is not what's driving this, but divorce law and child support law affects the attractiveness of marriage. So here, let me give you one sort of sobering policy finding, is that when child support enforcement goes up, which you think should be unequivocally good for kids, actually the share of kids without their dad in the home increases. Why? Because getting child support is an alternative to marriage, right? And another thing is like the establishment of paternity. Also, you think, well, that has to be unambiguously good, but no, there's studies showing that the establishment of paternity leads to a reduction in marriage. Because now I've established you're the dad, I can get money from you and not marry you. And so it's actually, it's very complicated, and I don't have clear views on how to reform things ultimately to the benefit of kids, or ultimately if we think a goal is to have more two-parent households.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.